who's in charge of their book publishing program. I'm being joined today by Lettie Conrad, who's also a senior associate at Maverick Publishing Specialists. She's had 20 years' experience in scholarly publishing, and her expertise lies in optimizing user engagement, discovery, and access of academic content platforms. She was previously at Sage. She's North American editor for Learned Publishing and a chef with the Scholarly Kitchen. Laura Ingle has worked in academic publishing for 20 years at Taylor & Francis, Macmillan and Oxford University Press, and she is currently head of marketing at Emerald Publishing. And finally, Athena Hoeppner is Discovery Services Librarian at the University of Central Florida and has been there for 25 years. She's currently in acquisitions, so she's paying all the bills. Probably most of you have noticed that over the last 18 months there's been a public health emergency. Hopefully you've noticed. I have, so it must have been in the news. And it's had an impact particularly on libraries and library usage. And we thought it would be a good idea to convene a panel to look at what have we learned so far about the changes in usage and what has it told us. And we're doing this with three perspectives. One, a librarian, which is Athena. The second is a researcher, which is Lettie. And the third is a publisher, which is Laura. So we're going to review some questions. If there's time, we'll take some questions from the audience at the end of the session. If not, we'll give you our emails and you can communicate. I'm here just to moderate the panel and not to give you any founts of wisdom because I don't have any, but I'm here to keep order and make sure there's no fights. Honestly. Okay, so the first question I've got, and I'm going to give it to Athena to answer, is what usage trends are you seeing recently, and what do they mean?
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm glad to be here today. I hope I can give some insights, but I did some looking at UCF's usage trends and a little bit of reading of the literature as well. And I think that our usage trends may be different than some other institutions. We are a very large institution with a lot of different programs, and we're in Florida. So those three things combined, I think, have pushed our usage to be a little bit different. So I looked at a couple of different things. First, I looked at user authentications into Open Athens, and I tried to see if there was a difference between last year, the pre-COVID years, and 2020. And I did see a dip overall in authentications from starting around February, dropping down into March, and then to my surprise, it sort of recovered in April and matched with just a slight increase for 2020 over the 2019 usage. The authentications sort of just bounced right back. And I tell you, we did swiftly transition. We pivoted to online instruction very quickly at the University of Central Florida. For years, we've had an emphasis on distributed learning because we are serving 70,000 students across Central Florida. So some of them are not coming to campus for many of their classes. In fact, about 5 years ago, I looked at our statistics, and 75% of the students were in mixed mode courses, at least one, enrolled in at least one mixed mode course. So that has only increased. So we were poised to be able to pivot quickly. And the statistics for authentications tell me that we did. I also looked at our counter usage data, of course, and to my surprise, it really didn't show much of a change at all. There was a dip in that same few months. There was a slight trough, and it sort of continued somewhat through the rest of 2020, but it was not down like I expected. And you know, it's really hard to predict what would have happened. We would have expected less just sort of, I'm coming to the library and using it. I have these sorts of assignments and I'm going to explore them. But we may have seen more, I don't know what the faculty did in terms of instruction. Did they switch to having more research assignments where people just go to the library and do research or not? I don't have that data. And we also don't know how many people were starting to use the resources simply because they were at home. There was this big announcement and push to say there's much more available to you online right now because all of the publishers opened up so much free stuff. So would that cause a decrease in usage or an increase? Anyway, I must say it's a bit confusing and hard to sort out. I did see a difference that the faculty and graduate student use remained more steady than the undergraduate use. That was one of the differences I was able to see. Other than that, I'm not sure that I have a great understanding of what was driving the use or lack of use throughout the year. I hate to have an ambiguous answer, but that's what I got.
Okay, thanks very much, Athena. Lettie, can you answer that question as well? And also particularly if you noticed anything, any significant difference in OA resources or freely available resources over that period?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a surprise at all that Athena is seeing trends at her library that may or may not match what's being reported kind of in some of the aggregated studies and some of the academic information user research that's starting to come out around patterns over the last, 18, 20 months. Absolutely, freely available usage is way up. In fact, that may be part of why many institutions aren't seeing the spikes that maybe publishers are, or we're seeing at the aggregated level, in part because freely available doesn't always attribute to the institution. But I think what's important coming out of the research, and certainly based on what I'm seeing when I talk to students and researchers and faculty, is that reading is up in general, reading across the board, primarily digitally. And folks are being quite open and a bit scrappy perhaps as to where their resources lie. Looking to ebook resources that they may not have before. In part, some researchers are reporting they just have had more time to read, and some of the increased kind of productivity in some fields reflect that. However, the kind of productivity trends across disciplines as well as across regions vary quite a bit. And there's some variability too around demographics where some female researchers haven't had the same bandwidth that their male counterparts have. Certainly the increased usage includes licensed resources. And what I've been hearing anecdotally is streaming media, ebooks, as I mentioned, databases in general, and the kind of expectations for what comes next and what this next school term is going to look like is really anyone's guess. There are so many factors that could sway trends in one way or another. I wonder, Laura, what are you seeing from the perspective of Emerald?
We are seeing a very mixed picture as well. As Athena was saying, we can't necessarily identify exactly what's happening. We were in a bit of an unusual position at the start of the pandemic because Emerald had just launched our proprietary platform and migrated Emerald Insight. So we were very closely monitoring our usage in a way that we hadn't been before to try and stabilize the platform. But it does make it difficult to compare year on year what's happening with usage. For example, because of the work we'd done with our development partners, we had prioritized our search over our browse. And in the past, we'd seen lots of serendipitous usage as people were trying to find what they were looking for, and that was falling down. So it was quite challenging to compare. However, we did see quite clear patterns emerging. As you said, we had lots of free content available, which we made available related to the COVID pandemic, but also lots of open access publishing. And the usage of all of that has increased significantly and is largely authenticated and unattributed, which means it's difficult for us to allocate it back to an individual institution. We're seeing spikes from certain countries where we're seeing drops in the institutional usage. We are seeing a huge amount more traffic to the site. We are seeing a lot of people coming in through Google and through search. There's clearly a hunger for information, and our open access usage has gone up by more than 100% year on year during the pandemic. However, we have seen very clear drops in usage usage as the individual countries or institutions have closed down. And in countries where they haven't been shut down, places like Taiwan, we've seen our usage skyrocket, especially in areas that are related to the pandemic, things like health and social care, and those subject areas. But where we know that our usage was largely due to students on campus, and those campuses are closed and there are infrastructure issues, we're seeing lower usage and drops happening that aren't rebounding. So in places like America and the UK, our usage has normalized, as Athena saw, but in other areas it's still very low. And we're just monitoring it on a really regular basis to try and identify what is happening and what's going to happen in the future.
Did you notice any difference between books and journals in terms of usage trends?
We did. Our book usage has dropped more than we expected to originally, and we think this is largely due to the fact that our books were very much used by students rather than researchers in many of the bigger customers. And as those campuses were closed, that reading around the subject may have closed down a little bit, as Athena and Lettie suggested.
Yes, sorry.
To follow up on that book usage question, to my surprise, the book usage has really spiked. It's up much, much more than the journal usage. It did drop at first, but it really bounced up.
Thank you. Okay, our second question is, what do these statistics tell you generally about resource usage during the pandemic? And we'll start with Lettie on that one.
Yeah, I think, I was looking at some reflections at the institutional level recently as far as how planning, went going into this fall term. I think as physical spaces are reopening, we'll continue to see high digital usage. For some, pandemic restrictions accelerated the use of emerging tech and catalyzed some of the institutional-wide usage. I've seen things like institutional-wide usage of notebooks, e-notebooks, Python notebooks, that kind of thing. But in-person, sort of enclosed spaces are still risky. So there's been some discussion around, labs and certain sort of computational facilities really remaining a question as far as, how to plan. It's unclear what impact we'll see to some of those research practices. We saw an increased use of data and data repositories, and I would predict, based on what I'm seeing in the literature, I would predict that that will increase, especially as funders and publishers increase their data policies. So I think that will become more of a priority for researchers. I think we've seen across many disciplines, we've seen an increased collaboration across institutions. So that could impact institutional usage to some degree, perhaps where there's collaboration or sharing going on where there wasn't before. So I'm guessing that that will continue to grow. Even where travel restrictions might be lifted, other limitations are going to prevent scholars from moving around, as we've seen with this digital conference and with others, using the hybrid model. Social media usage is another one that, although it's not, sort of counter-reported, I think it's worth noting that researchers have, really in the last 18 to 20 months, sort of solidified their view of social media being, an ideal channel to keep up to date and to connect with researchers across the globe. And that's sort of beginning to replace things like e-talk alerts or email alerts for new journal issues. So I think some of those trends will continue as well. Athena, what do you think from your perspective at UCF?
I think that the trend towards online education is going to continue, and we had MOOCs sort of show up a while ago, and then they just sort of persisted without really seeming to do much. And I really wonder if the push towards open, the push towards learning at home, and the push towards open education resources, in addition to open access books and articles, is really going to make that have legs now. I think that academia is really going to lean into mixed mode learning all the time. I would be surprised if there were classes that didn't have some online component in 5 years. Even if it's an art class where you're going to be coming in and doing studio work, having a component that you can use for online discourse and sharing of documents and slides seems like a natural direction. And then with that, I would think that the online library content or open access content, wherever it may come from, I think is going to be continue to be part of that environment. Plus, I think that the world became used to being able to access more content online because it was freely available, like the emergency public library. So even if you weren't a researcher, even if you weren't looking for the content about COVID research and things like that people expected to be free, suddenly you're able to get books and not feel like, oh, I'm being a pirate and stealing this online book. I would be able to go out and use a copy of it for free. So I think it's going to have a lasting change on the perception of what people expect to get online and how they expect to get it. I feel like that was kind of a scattered answer. Feel free to ask follow-up.
Athena, just a follow-up for that. Can usage data shed light on how students, faculty, and researchers are coping with distress and uncertainty? And what can it tell us about the digital divide?
I do not know, actually. With the data that I have, it cannot tell me because this is one thing that has been sort of difficult when I'm trying to figure out who's using our things. I have the authentication information from we use Open Athens, which gives me some attributes about our users. Before we were on Easy Proxy, so I didn't have any information, just that they were able to authenticate and get an IP address. Now I at least can say this person is a faculty, a student, and I can get some limited set of attributes about our users, but I can't tell very much more. I can't tell, is this a female person? Is it someone in nursing or someone in anthropology? I don't have any of that data from our usage information. So it's very hard for me to draw conclusions. And I also don't, when I look at my counter reports, unless I put in hours and hours of work, I can't sort it and see what the usage is by topic. I can see, unless I go through and do an alignment between an ISSN and an ISBN, and then some export that takes that same number and matches it to Library of Congress or subjects, I don't have that data. And frankly, there's very few libraries that have the resources to try and do that kind of assessment. So I'd really see that I'd like to see that be a growth area somehow, making that an easier process. I know it's a disappointing answer. I am sorry.
That's good. Okay, Laura, can you answer that question? Do you have any data from a publisher perspective?
I'm going to say, as with Athena, it's really challenging to get that information. What we can do as a publisher is layer up other data sets. So we have the counter reports, which gives us our download numbers, but we can see some user behavior on the site from our web analytics. And that has enabled us to identify patterns that have changed of usage. For example, in certain countries where we can see individual librarians perhaps downloading many articles on behalf of other users, or students' behaviours start to change. We can see things like our help requests increase as people are asking for support because they want to access the content. But we can also see a real hunger for information and people really wanting to learn and still access this content, even though there's a pandemic going on. One of the things we'd like to do more of is to dive into that data, but at the moment it has to be us identifying a trend and perhaps reaching out anecdotally to our colleagues and our partners across the world to find out whether they can shed light on what we're seeing with that user behaviour. Is it because of the way the students are working and other things like that? We are, though, really trying to help to identify what those things are, because they will help us to develop the platform as we go forward. And if people are feeling distressed or uncertain, the easier we can make their journey, the better. We are seeing things clearly about digital divide, though. As I said, we can see infrastructure issues because of the usage drops in specific countries where we know that people don't have the infrastructure, and we can work directly with those institutions to help support them as much as we can to help their users and students to access the content.
I love that, Laura. I love that, drawing on data points like your help requests and looking at regional variations. I think this is the sort of question that's prime for library publisher collaboration, because we do have different data points and we do have different insights into those populations. I think to answer this question, it's a matter of all of us coming together with those various data points, both quantitative and qualitative, right? You know, there are aspects of the human experience that can really only be understood through one-to-one interviews, focus groups, even surveys, right? Other modes of assessing what's going on with users, and put that alongside our usage statistics so that we have a qualitative sort of source to inform what we're seeing in the data. Just a thought.
I was going to ask Laura if you can learn anything by the variations on resource types or regions or disciplines that people are looking for.
Absolutely. We are primarily a social science publisher. We don't have medical research, and therefore we haven't seen some of the spikes that our colleagues and competitors have seen as they've accessed the medical research. We have seen an increase in areas that are linked to the pandemic in some way. So things like health and social care, education, business and management, as we know that people are trying to adjust to the new ways of living. And we have seen a drop in, well, not a drop, but a smaller growth in some subject areas. And unfortunately, that includes things like library and information studies, as I think that a lot of our colleagues have been busy focusing on providing access for their users than being able to do research. As I said before, in regions like Taiwan, where they haven't had lockdowns, and we have seen they're not as impacted by the pandemic in the same way as other countries, they have seen a huge increase in usage across all of the subject areas and all product types. Our case studies, our teaching products, have been more used in some regions as they've switched to online learning, and less used in others where they've, we think, switched more to textbooks and offline learning tools. But again, the only way we can validate some of that information is by getting close to our customers and asking more.
Okay, thanks very much. And the final question is, what comes next and where do we go from here? And we'll start with Athena, particularly, and you've already highlighted some of this already, what data do we need to round out our analysis? And how can we adapt assessment routines to address the needs and challenges of users in these disrupted times?
I think to round out the analysis, it's one of the challenges, I gave a slightly incomplete answer last time. One of the challenges with our counter reports is that we have large packages. If we were buying smaller packages that were more subject focused, it would be easier. But if you have widely online and your 2,000 titles in there across all disciplines, then it becomes more difficult. So data that, I wonder if it would be possible for the publishers to provide special reports that did sort of lump them into the discipline sets that they sell, even if we're not purchasing them that way. So it would be easier to get a sense of how things are being used. Counter does not provide that. So getting into the granular topical usage within a package would be useful. Also, we have been struggling for years to try and get information about how the resources are embedded into classes, and that would be, I think, very telling. So we could see, is there more use when something's in a class, and what did the courses do differently in response to this sort of situation? So we really can't get that level of information out of our usage information. We could look at Google Analytics and say, oh, yes, we had a connection come from the course where over into our authentication system, but it doesn't really tell us anything about what was used or what was done with it after that. So it's a very incomplete picture. And also, I think, just as was mentioned before, dialogue. We have to get closer with our customers, our user base, whether it's the faculty or students. I think we need to find out a little, we maybe have more surveys about what's going on with your life. Why are you using a library resource? Or the harder question is, why aren't you using a library resource? How do we get that answered? And I think really the only way is to have good connections and dialogues.
Thanks, Athena. Laura, would you like to answer that question?
I'll try. I think we do need to be better at layering up the data we've got and finding ways of sharing it more effectively with our customers and users. We've been able to reprioritize the way that we look at our data, moving away from just those counter numbers and layering in traffic and information about the user behavior as well, which we hope will help us to inform developments we need to do on the platform as we improve the roadmap, so that we can make it as easy as possible for users to authenticate, for example, so that that can then be captured by their librarians. We are trying to be more proactive with our data use, and we've actually rallied a squad around the data and analytics to help inform the roadmap as we go forward in improving the platform for our users. But it is a case of trying to get as many different data points together to give a really holistic view of what we can see, and then using that to speak to our customers and users more as we go forward.
Thanks. And Lettie?
I'm sitting over here nodding vigorously. I love when Laura talks about harnessing data to improve the user experience. I feel like the pandemic, as I said, has been a catalyst for digital first thinking in organizations, really of all types, publishers, libraries. And I'd like to see that increase. I'd like to see that continue. And specifically to include a sort of value exchange with users, where users can opt in, share some basic data, and enjoy some personalization, some more rapid and smooth authentication experiences. Research shows the cognitive load and the sort of cognitive disruptions when we put points of friction in the user journey and the user workflow. So I really think users need all of us to come together around an experience-orientated sort of architecture. And as I say, share data points, use mixed methods sort of approaches to understanding what's going on with users and putting their experience first. We will continue to see more engagement with video, with ebooks, with social. We need to invest there. We need to be watching what users are doing, what researchers are doing, and the ways in which those practices are changing. It's incumbent on us, all of us collectively, to respond to those changing patterns. So I think that does mean harnessing analytics in new ways of working, new ways of thinking about what we're doing, move toward that experience mindset.
So this is sort of a follow-up both to my answer and what you just said. One thing that I mentioned earlier was we moved to a SAML-based authentication in Open Athens, which means we can pass attributes. And I am curious how that has affected both what you can understand as a publisher, and also just to mention that the attributes that are sent by any institution to the service provider are set by the institution. So at UCF, we're not sending very many. In fact, we're not organized in a way that we can send very many attributes. But I'm wondering if you saw a better user experience and also better data from any other libraries if they had it set up differently, where they were giving you more information about the users. Because you mentioned personalization, which is something that I would love to see happen more, as long as it could be privacy preserving, or at least let the users have control of what data they're sharing and how it's being used. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll let Laura chime in as far as her experience directly. What I've seen generally from publishers is, yeah, especially when we're using shared protocols, in SAML-based authentication, where we're able to pass those attributes. I actually understand the privacy controls to be even better, and you are able to limit what you send to a provider, what impact that has at the publisher level, I'm not able to speak to that from a first person perspective, but maybe Laura can talk a bit about your data strategy as far as working with libraries that are set up that way.
So at the moment, we're not doing a vast amount with the attribute data because, as you said, a lot of universities have opted out of providing that information. We're using things more granularly, like if people have set up their own personal profiles, and we can recognise them based on that, or whether it's off-campus and on-campus usage, those kind of attributes at the moment. But it is something that we are looking at for next year, about how can we personalise and provide a closer experience. Because of our analytics provider and our counter provider and authentication provider, we can provide bespoke messaging, for example. So we know if we knew that there was a user or a library or a consortium that was having some access problems specifically, we could put messaging out to those customers directly to let them know how we could help them. Fortunately, we didn't have to use that very much last year, but it's very much on the roadmap for next year.
I'm seeing an Emerald UCF pilot program here. No, I do think this is one of those areas that's ripe for experimentation between publishers and libraries, as far as working together to streamline that user experience. I think we have more shared goals, more alike than we do. There's more we agree on than disagree. So I think it's a good time to experiment a bit.
Thanks. I've got a question for Laura. The others can answer as well. But before COVID, I mean, journals were more or less all available electronically, but books were still being sold in print and electronically. Have you noticed a significant switch in books from print to e?
To some extent, and in some markets, yes, we did see a decline in print book sales to libraries in some markets. However, we still saw print sales through directly through third parties or directly to users individually. So we have seen a slight drop off in some print book sales, but that has bounced back in some territories now. So I think it was as universities closed down and they weren't there to be able to order that we closed down, and other universities chose the opportunity to switch to online that they'd been moving towards slowly, which has been really great to see, and hopefully a better experience.
What about you, Athena?
I go by "Hey you," it's fine.
Too many things to remember.
Yes. Well, I think, sorry, I think I lost a little bit of the thread of the question because I started thinking about controlled digital lending in response to ebooks. And I think that we are definitely eager for that, and there are conversations, I think, across the board with academic libraries of how can we move controlled digital lending of ebooks forward so that we did see a demand for ebooks. Our print usage, the demand plummeted when people went off campus, of course, but then when it did start to come back, we couldn't really meet the demand because we weren't lending in physical books. So we participated in the Hati Trust program and tried to lend digital copies of things that we hadn't had before. And I think that the expectation that we should have an electronic version of any of the book content that we have is in our users' minds now. So I would like to see a way for us to be able to use controlled digital lending to help meet that expectation. Did I answer your question? Like I had lost the thread.
I think you did, yeah. And Lettie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, although I was watching some of the comments in the chat, our collective reliance on counter stats, is something that I think is worth looking at. I mentioned experimentation, across our various sectors, and I think statistics and analytics are one of those. If we had some shared, metrics on good usage or, what we're expecting. Sometimes those analytics can help set expectations and also open up conversations about what's going on with the user, what's going on in the user journey that we could potentially have influence over. I did have a question actually for both Athena and Laura, if I might. I'm curious what you all can see from your perspectives as far as how users have begun their discovery journey, or essentially what their starting points have been. For instance, I know many publishers see mainstream search engine referrals, Google search result referrals, as a pretty dominant, source of traffic. Has that changed? Did that increase? And for Athena, have there been changes in usage of your library discovery service or any of your sort of pathfinders or other sort of entry points to content? Whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll start. I'm very grabby. So we have seen some change, but it's really hard to know why, because we were an EBSCO Discovery Service library, and over the last approximately a year, we've been planning and implementing Alma and Primo VE. So of course, we changed our discovery layer, and we did see a decline in the discovery usage, but I think that there were two reasons for that. One, the instruction librarians started to tell people we're going to switch this, and we started not emphasizing the EBSCO discovery system as much. We started to try and pull it back out. We had an API in our course management that would help faculty automatically put in links from EBSCO Discovery, and all these things we started pulling away from. And then it's taken a while to ramp up the Primo VE. So we don't have really good data right now. I keep saying that. We just don't have good data. But I also know that using Google and Google Scholar is extremely popular on campus. I know I use it. It's a great place if you're just going to sort of poke around at a topic to just look what comes up in Google Scholar. You don't have to, I'm going to navigate to a different place and start a search in a search box that gives me a less familiar interface. Everyone's used to Google. So I am really not surprised that that is still the predominant way that people are connecting to the content.
I would say the same. We have seen a massive increase in Google and Google Scholar usage as the point of entry. However, we have also, with the launch of our new platform, vastly increased our SEO. So we can't be sure whether it's COVID related or platform related. What we have seen, though, is one of the developments we launched recently was seamless access, and that has led to a significant uplift straight away of authenticated, federated usage through discovery services. So we are seeing that there's a slight change in the last couple of months as that has come live. But yeah, Google seems to be where a lot of people have started their research in the last few months. And that's possibly because of, again, student behaviour. They aren't necessarily on campus being told to sit in the library and use the catalogues.
Okay. Okay, actually, I saw on the chat there from Tim Lloyd, there was an interesting point about the distinction between counter reports and the metrics that underpin them, and that we could customize reports to try and meet some of the requirements. And I think one of the things that's come clear is that the reporting is okay for simple needs, but in terms of being able to analyze the data and getting more detail, we could do with some improvement. And that may be cooperation between publishers and libraries to be able to generate that sort of information, but it would be useful to do that. Anyway, I'd like to thank our panelists, Athena, Lettie and Laura. I keep on looking over there. Laura and Lettie are 3,000 miles apart, east and west, which is good. Although I find I'm still getting used to this virtual meeting, and my neck is now hurting from having to look on that screen, so I've got to take extra precautions next time. But thanks very much for you attending both virtually and in person. And I hope you enjoyed the session. I think it might be good if we revisited this in a year's time to see what's changed and what we've learned since then. But thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.